So we're going to start with the second to last session of Focus for this week. This session has to do with sustainable financing for transboundary water cooperation. The conveners are the Development Bank of Latin America, Inter-American Development Bank, National Water Commission, the FEMSA Foundation, Mexican Water for People. I work in the Inter-American Development Bank, and it's going to be a pleasure to be with you as the moderator of this session. Before we begin, we would like to remind you that this session is going to be both in English as in Spanish, so please, for those who are here, use the application that is available, and for those who are following us online, please connect to the preferred language and the options you have in your screen. So to start the session, I'm going to give the word to Franz Rojas, who is the Director of Agua y Saneamiento in CAF. He's going to tell us about sustainable financing for transboundary water. Franz is here with us, so thank you everybody and welcome. Thank you very much, Ana Maria, for this introduction.
Just a few words in English. I'm very glad to be in this session to learn and discuss on financing for transboundary water cooperation. Because we are going to have the simultaneous translation, I'm going to switch to Spanish.
Thank you very much. So I would like to start this session by pointing out that we all know water is life, but it can also be a source of conflict. This has been referred during the inauguration of this week. And conflicts can be between users of the same country or between countries who are competing for the use of water, contamination, infrastructure, build, even downwater, and so on. And lack of access to water is a fundamental thing for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have 30% of the water in the world, but it is also true that distribution is not symmetrical. There's abundance and there's excess in some areas, and there's scarcity in others. And this region is highly interconnected, in particular regarding water resources. 22 countries in the region shared this transboundary water, and this represents 70% giving means of life for approximately 40% of the population, about 250 million people. And we speak about 70 transboundary water basins, 31 in Central America, 37 in South America, and one which is shared among both regions. But for you to understand the importance, only 3 basins, Amazonas, Plata, and Orinoco, cover about 10 million square meters. And many countries, in the case of the Amazonas, 8 countries, in the basin of Plata, 5, and I could continue. So it is very important for us to reiterate that cooperation, coordination, water management in the region must be a rule. It is very clear that what is upstream and transboundary will have positive or negative effects downstream. In this, when we refer to financing transboundary water, it can be done in 2 manners. Joint action through multilateral or supranational organizations, or also through actions that the countries do in their own territory. But this is part of the transboundary basin, and therefore it has a positive or negative impact. So allow me to mention that CAF has been supporting through the use of climate funds, both of the CAF with projects of supranational basins, such as the Intergovernmental Committee of the Basin of Plata that is in 5 countries, or the Guarani system that will be spoken about by CAF, and as binational and 3 national commissions like the ones we have in the Uruguay River with funds and resources that we help support it, and we have many similarities with the Bermejo River and for the benefit of the 5 countries. But CAF has also supported in amongst different frontiers and boundaries. For instance, the residual waters in El Salto that are treated at a 3rd level, and they and in the Uruguay River that use waters as in Uruguay, both in Uruguay and Argentina, and the ones that we are financing now in the Lema River in El Salvador. And that is a basin that is shared by Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. On another side, we have residual waters in Mariano Roque Alonso in Paraguay that end in Paraguay River, which is an international source for the Paraná River, which is international. And today we're going to have the opportunity of sharing different experiences with an innovative model in Mexico with the possibility of leveraging resources by the fulfilling of KPIs with Salvador. It is a pleasure to see you here with us, Salvador Lopez. We will always also have Mario Velasquez from Water for People, experiences from Brazil and Colombia from WRI. Welcome, Todd. And also some experiences in the Caribbean, and finally the experience of the Guarani system, which is a world reference that is in our region. So welcome, Alberto Manganello. So to begin this session, let me say that innovation should not only be technological, especially when we speak about big data and AI, but we are also called to promote innovation both in the social, environmental, and financial, and that's why it is possible to use climate funds more and better, but also promote generation of incomes like selling services, loans with a multilateral bank like the one I represent, which must promote innovation with impact bonus and loans in second nature that are these loans in second generation debt or blue piece bonds that we're seeing in other places. And of course, also attracting other actors who have not been financing traditionally through combined blended finance to lever this and bring more resources to the region. So having pointed this out, it is a pleasure for me to begin this session and invite all of our guests to follow us and those who are hearing us on English. So thank you. And Ana Maria, over to you. Thank you very much, Franz, for these kind words to open the session. Allow me to remind you that the session is going to be both in English as in Spanish. The session is 11883. For those who want to use the interpretation service. So now we're going to go to our second panelist of the session, Suzanne Schmeier. She's an associated professor of Water Law and Diplomacy and the head of Water Governance Department, courtesy faculty member in the Oregon State University Global Environment Facility Scientific and Technical Advisor Member Panel of the International Water. She's going to talk to us about the importance of diplomacy for sustainable financing in Transboundary Water Cooperation.
Suzanne, for being here with us.
Gracias. I will have to switch to English. That will make it easier for me, but also easier for you to understand anything that I'm saying, because unfortunately I wouldn't be able to do that in Spanish, but working on it. Well, I think it's a great session, and I'm happy to see actually a lot of you here. It's the second last day, and it's after lunch, so that's usually difficult. But I think the fact that you're here really shows how important the topic is. You've probably heard here at the Water Week already a lot of discussion about shortages the water sector is facing in terms of financial resources, the global water crisis, which to a large extent also stems from the fact that there's underfunding. But we hear less typically about the specific field of transboundary water resources, where we have the general challenges of funding and financing that the water sector is facing, combined with an additional level of complexity that we see in the 313 transboundary river basins, more than 300 transboundary aquifers, and more than 300 transboundary wetlands that we have around the world, which is that additional complexity that not only at the national level different sectors are competing for funding, but we have that additional transboundary level where we have tensions between countries, tension between sectors, and all that coming with extra risks that often nobody is willing to pay for or to take into account when funding and financing these processes. But let's be a bit more specific. What exactly do we need the funds for? What do we need the money for? I think we can generally differentiate between two elements. We can look at core costs, and that is something that's represented in the pictures, for example, that you see here of the different basin organizations, of the gentlemen and very few ladies standing there discussing. So the whole process of setting up negotiation, processes of water diplomacy, establishing basin organizations, funding basin organizations, simply making sure that those who work at a basin organization have a desk, have a car, have a laptop, all the things that we often don't think about when we think funding cooperation, but that needs to be there for any other bigger cooperation, any joint projects to happen. And that is what we see on the other side here, which I would call program costs. That is what actually makes cooperation move forward. That is what leads to benefits of cooperation. So gathering data, analyzing data, sharing data, but also putting data to use. For example, protecting people from floods through transboundary flood forecasting and flood warning systems is something that does require budget. But also developing infrastructure or developing joint basin management activities. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but we see from experiences around the world, for example, that simply developing a state of the basin report, a transboundary diagnostic assessment for a basin, something that you should do every 5 to 6 years, can cost something between $500,000 and $1.5 million, just looking at basins that I've worked in recently. The implementation of these basin management plans are often way more expensive, can go from some millions to billions if we're also talking actual infrastructure investments. The operation of infrastructure, but also the maintenance of infrastructure, is something that does come with financial needs. Estimates typically say it's something between 0.5 to 6% of the initial investment costs that you would need every year to maintain a certain infrastructure projects. So there's a lot of funding that's needed. The good thing is, or the good news is, that there's also a lot of sources for funding and financing out there. We can, first of all, and I think that's really key, there's a reason for why I put it first, look at public funding. So funding that's coming directly from member countries as contributions to basin organizations. We can also look, of course, at external contributions from international development banks, from bilateral donors, but also at what many would call innovative solutions, such as fees for services, fees for projects, but also maybe contributions from regional organizations. There are basin organizations that rely on regional taxes for import that are being collected and partly fund basin management. So there's quite a bit out there. And of course, we also have the private funding, generally to be differentiated in debt equity and credit guarantees. And that is something that is often discussed here. When we hear, not only here, but also here at the Water Week, when there's a discussion about funding and financing transboundary cooperation, it's very often about how do we tap these sources, the second ones that I just mentioned, the innovative ones. There's very little discussion about the first part, right, which I would call the basis. And that is why I would like to highlight in my talk today really the question of sustainability, the question of how to get sustainable funds that are always there when you need them, that are there in a long, reliable manner, and for which you don't depend on political decisions and so on. And I think that is key, because otherwise we do face a vicious cycle where a lack of funding, whether long-term or occurring at a certain point in time, can limit cooperation, can lead a basin organization to stall. We've seen this in the Okavango, for example, some years ago, also in the Mekong, when a sudden shortage in funding led them to let go of staff, stop certain projects. And this can lead to not only limited cooperation, but also limited benefits of cooperation, which then often makes countries, but also external donors, external private investors, reduce or see their interest in supporting that process reduced, which leads you into this vicious cycle that you have even less cooperation, even less benefits, so even less interest, and that goes down. And that is why what I want to highlight as well is why framework conditions matter so much. So it's not only about always tapping into innovative financing and funding resources, but also making sure that the framework conditions that help us to either generate more investment from more investment and enter into a virtuous cycle, or that make us face the risk of this vicious cycle that I just described, those framework conditions are what defines it. So it's basin treaties, it's basin organizations, it's institutional frameworks with technical, human, organizational capacity, but also, I think last but not least, important to mention, political willingness. The willingness of politicians, especially outside of the water sector, to put funding into the water sector in general and into transboundary water cooperation specifically, which they will only do if they do see the benefits. And making them see the benefits is increasingly difficult in times of a poly-crisis where, it's 2 minutes already, 2 minutes ago, but I'll wrap up. At times of a poly-crisis where politicians have to deal with an economic crisis, a global health crisis, wars, conflicts, instability everywhere. So the question, how do we actually put beyond the water sector the need for funding on the table? And with that, I will follow the advice that I'm getting to actually wrap up and leave you just with a few concluding messages that I hope we'll also discuss in the session. Really, the importance of funding and financing for the water sector, and especially transboundary cooperation, which is even more difficult than water in itself, but also the importance of these framework conditions to ensure that public funding as the basis, and then additional innovative, whether private, public, or blended, or PPP sources coming on top of that will be sustained in the future. And I would just invite you to have a look at the publication that you see here, which I did for UNECE a few years ago, where all of that is, you can find that in much more detail and with many more case studies. And with that, I leave you with a picture of the Amazon that I was happy to take a few years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm going to switch back to Spanish.
We're going to go to the next 30 minutes where we'll share a series of presentations, 5 exactly, where we're going to explore a variety of points of view regarding innovative financing, sustainable financing for the transboundary cooperation. The first presentation, is that okay? Yes. Okay, so the first presentation is going to be made by Salvador Lopez. He is the Chief Environmental Office in NADBank, and he's going to talk to us about the experience that this institution has focused on binational cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. So, Salvador, thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you, Ana Maria. And it's my pleasure to say hello to everyone who's there. Please let me know once you can see my PowerPoint. I think you have it there, right? Yes, we can see it. We can see it. Okay, thank you very much. Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the experience of the NADBank. The North American Development Bank is an institution focused on binational cooperation regarding accounts, and regarding basins and rivers, but also about environmental cooperation in general, being that water is one of the most important pillars. Well, the bank is 30 years old, but back then it was highly innovative because it was what we understand as the first green bank, let's say. Now that's something very fashionable. Well, 30 years ago, it was not that common to have an exclusively environmental mandate to finance projects and infrastructures of the environment. In this case, focused on the binational frontiers between the U.S. and Mexico. And it was because the free commerce was being dealt there, and it had to grow both in population as an economic activity, and it was to generate greater expressions both in the infrastructure as an environment. So the mandate was wide, as I'm mentioning. Water, of course, is our first priority, and here we work in all of its life cycle, from the captation to drinking to distribution to then sanitation, gathering, collection, and treatment, and well, issues that have to do with water indirectly, both in manufacture, urban development, and of course, environmental change is something that can not be left aside. So how is it that we support communities? We have 3 main tools. Being a bank, of course, we have loans. Those loans can go to the public or private sector and to projects with the public or private participation, or mixed as we have in Mexico. And most of it goes to the public sector, but we do see that there's space and opportunities for private participation, especially for big-scale projects. We have financed the water projects, water treatment projects, which were very big, where the participation from the private sector was very important. We also have grants where there's always for some difficult project or communities that are difficult to finance. And so here we have a couple of tools, being the biggest one of those. The EPA-funded Border Environment Infrastructure Fund, which can be done so that we can avoid contaminated water amongst the border. And of course, the technical assistance is always very important to develop a pipeline. This is to try to strengthen the institutions. We have had a considerable advancement in closing the remaining gap in access to basic water and sanitation infrastructure. There's always something to do in smaller cities, especially. Some infrastructures are ending their useful life. But the elephant in the room is the issue of diversifying water resources amongst the borders in Mexico and the US. And I can imagine that this is something that happens in many countries that's focused on one or several sources. And this makes us more vulnerable to drought and to climate change. So the bank now is very focused on conservation and sanitation, and also making emphasis on the agricultural use, as in many of your countries where 70 or 80% of the water is used by the agricultural sector, with many losses for low-value crops. And that transformation is something that the bank sees as something necessary to have a final solution. This is a quick example about a project that was fairly successful and reason where the bank gave a sustainable loan for 150 million to the state government, and the state government lends this to 5 water utilities. For the ones, well, Tijuana is a city that has 1 million of inhabitants, and it's part of the state, and the operating organisms use this money to do water and sanitation projects. But what makes it very interesting is that some operators fulfill some KPA goals, then the state condones their debt, and that money can be reinvested in more sanitation projects. We think that it is very important because, one, it's a considerable amount for Mexican standards. 2, this money continues circulating. And 3, we try with this to strengthen the institutions of the water operators, which is something that is generally lacking in the region. Then all of this matter of cooperation when we're doing a comprehensive wastewater system improvement. I'm not going to go into numbers, but here you can see the combination of resources that exist, both as credit, as loans from the US, but also with contributions of the 3 levels of governments in Mexico and the International Commission of Limits in Water. And with that, Ana Maria, I'll pass you back the floor. And of course, I'm here available for any questions. Thank you very much, Salvador, for this very interesting perspective and experience that you've shared with us.
Entonces, and now I'm going to switch back to English, and I will go and I will hand on the word to Todd Gardner. He's the director of Cities for Forest and the Infrastructure Initiative of the World Resource Institute, WRI, and today he will share with us an interesting perspective on prioritizing nature-based solutions through creative multi-stakeholder funding. Todd, it's always a pleasure to have you here with us at Focus on the Americas. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
And I think. Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Again, Todd Gartner. I'm based in Durango, Colorado. I've been at the World Resources Institute for 14 years now and have the privilege of being the global director of Cities for Forests and the Natural Infrastructure Initiative. We work with over 90 cities across the globe, helping them meet their priorities and address challenges by harnessing the power of nature. Over 25 of those cities are in the LAC region. And yes, we focus on capacity building and furthering enabling conditions, but really where we spend a majority of our time is in helping articulate a clear economic business rationale for investing in nature-based solutions and green-gray infrastructure for water and climate resilience, and how we then turn that economic argument into a financial proposition and structuring the funds of flows and finance. We work within the four walls of a city, dealing with stormwater management, flood control, but a lot of our work is also in the neighboring watersheds, which means that we work across jurisdictions. So many of the other presenters, when they refer to Transboundary, are talking about country-to-country collaboration around large lake or river systems. I'm going to be taking a slightly different frame and thinking about agency to agency. How can a water utility partner with the Department of Transportation, the Environmental Finance Ministry, the Public Works Department, to collaborate to get nature-based solutions implemented and financed at a much larger scale? The default is silos. Each agency, each ministry, each stakeholder group has its own mandate and ambitions, and very little coordination across the aisle. But if you line up those priorities, I would bet that you're going to see much more alignment than you will see differences. If you're the Department of Transportation and need to protect your roads and bridges from floods, well, it would be great to think about your capital planning and long-term priorities alongside the stormwater and flood control district. If you're the the Finance Ministry and need to efficiently deploy resources to the subnational level, how can you work on the front end in terms of program design and long-term implementation with the other agencies who similarly are looking to attract that finance and drive it to the ground? The beauty of this type of cooperation is that each agency, each ministry can pitch in a little bit of funding, but recognize the full suite of benefits. If done well, planning can be much more efficient, implementation can be much faster, and at least the initial anchor of funding can be greater, hopefully unlocking much more innovative and scale sources of resources. And so just giving one concrete example, no pun intended, because it's actually on the nature side here, Bogota, Colombia. Drought concerns, water quality issues, flood realities are increasingly impacting a growing population. And the default approach was to invest in more gray infrastructure, and that will always be part of the solution. But we work with that broad spectrum of stakeholders, agencies, ministries, financiers to think about, if we all came together, could we come up with a program design that would dramatically reduce transaction costs, increase the likeliness of success, and set the stage from these different revenue streams to be able to tap into more innovative sources of financing? It started by looking at what is that return on investment and economic argument. And when we looked at the prioritization of even just 2,500 hectares, a combination of restoration, enhanced management of degraded agricultural lands, and better enforcement and protection of protected areas, we were able to recognize over $40 million of cost avoidance simply from sedimentation and nutrient reduction alone. We were almost able to double that when you think about the co-benefits that would be accrued across different agencies, ministries, and stakeholder groups, leading to over a 12% ROI with a very aggressive discount rate. We were then able to think about how that might set the stage for different colors of funding and finance. We are currently working with the utility of Bogota right now to understand how to tap into their operating budget to finance the first 2,500 hectares of restoration. We are working with a group of 20 so-odd partners to think about how to put together a green climate fund proposal that would unlock over $50 million to start to get implementation at scale. We're looking at the green bond market, talking to the IDB, many others, to understand how does this transboundary cooperation in this context set us up for large-scale implementation that can happen quickly and unlock all different sources of funding and finance. Happy to go into more detail when we get to the question and answer. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd, as always.
We're virtually connected once again to listen to the talk of Mario Velasquez and Madam Martinez, Water for People. They will be addressing the impact of forest incentive programs in the basin of the High Grijalva Basin and to strengthen financial mechanisms for the management of water-producing areas. You both have the floor. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this space. With Mario Velasquez, we wish to share the work we've carried out in Guatemala through the National Forest Institute and with the cooperation of agencies like Water for People concerning recovery and conservation of strategic forests for the conservation of water. Let me underscore a few important results in the highlands of the Grijalva River. This is a borderland of vital importance for Guatemala and for Mexico. Thus, with the creation of the forest legislation in Guatemala back in 1996, we established the path to be able to implement financial tools and public policies. In other words, the forest incentive programs, PIM for PIMPEP and ProBosque, to restore and conserve the strategic forests for the production of environmental services, with the production of water, basically for human consumption. Now, with the forest incentive programs that have been implemented in Guatemala, we have been able to recover and conserve over 7,025 hectares. It's an investment of more or less $115 million. And with these actions, we have been able to achieve an important impact with a recovery and conservation of 227,000 hectares of strategic woods for the production of water. Now, in this case, to be able to supply basically the communities that are found in the different municipalities and departments, equivalent more or less to a 32% of the total area of these forests that are being managed, benefiting over 46,300 families in this land, in this territory. Now, during this meeting, we wish to underscore the impacts concerning recovery and conservation of forests that produce water, specifically in the highlands of this very important watershed of the Grijalva River. It occupies 48% of the Guatemalan territory, and it has the presence of 107 municipalities and 9 departments, as they're called in Guatemala, in the country, with a total population of 4.6 million people that live in the basin. Implementing, of course, joint actions for the conservation of forests and the strengthening of the local communities to be able to manage the supply of water with quality. In the highlands of the Grijalva watershed, the Guatemalan state, by means of our own taxes, has promoted the execution of 13,800 small-sized and medium-sized forest projects, allowing the recovery and conservation of over 95,800 hectares of forests where water is produced, equivalent to an investment of $122 million, benefiting over 23,700 families. as a specific result of all of this. Having said this, we believe that the forced incentive programs as financial mechanisms for the long term and other supporting programs concerning local development, like, for example, the one carried out by Water for People in the territory, they need to carry out partnerships to be able to obtain better results, which will be translated into life quality for the population. Mario, you have the floor. Well, thank you. Let me underscore what Herles has just said. We find ourselves in a particular basin that's shared with Mexico and Guatemala. It has a crucial role to play concerning the provision of water services to the different communities. In the last 15 years, Water for People has worked constantly in this region, and we have been able to achieve significant achievements. We've collaborated with the Forest National Institute using the forest incentives to be able to protect the high parts of the basin, which are vital for the conservation of the water sources. Hence, thanks to this partnership, we have been able to preserve and restore key locations that guarantee the sustainability of water resources in the region. And through our work, our joint work, we have worked in 182 communities, and we have impacted more or less many inhabitants, providing water and sanitation services, high quality ones, by the way. And in these municipalities, 270 schools and 25 health services now have 100% of safe water management and sanitation. This definitely represents significant progress in life quality and in public health of these communities. We are sure that these achievements would not have been possible without the collaboration of the different municipalities in the communities and the Forest Institute through these forest incentives, because this has allowed sustainable management of the forests in the highlands of the basin. This joint effort not only protects natural resources, but also assures continuity of water services, which are crucial for the well-being of the communities in the Quiché region. Because our last goal is for everybody to have water and sanitation forever. Thank you. Did you finish with your presentation? Yes, we did. Well, thank you kindly. And thank you both. Thank you for being connected with us. Let's go on to the next presentation.
And I'm going to switch to English to introduce our next speaker. His name is Christopher Husbands. Christopher is the coordinator for the Caribbean Water Utility Insurance Collective, QUIC. I love the acronym, by the way. Christopher will present the experience of QUIC as an example of cooperation between water utilities in the Caribbean that are strengthening disaster resilience in the region. Thank you for being here, Chris, with us. And the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you very much, Anna. As Anna said, the Caribbean Water Utility Insurance Collective, QUIC, is the acronym we use, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of QUIC this afternoon. For geographic reference, this is we have the pointer here. This is the Caribbean region here, and we basically it's a program supporting the utilities of the English-speaking the Caribbean, including Belize, Guyana, and Suriname. Why QUIC? This slide sums it up. This is a replication of the storm tracks from 1850s. And what this basically shows is that the Caribbean region has always been in a vulnerable position and will always be in a vulnerable position based on the Earth's natural movement. Now, the colors of those storms will change. Climate change is expected to affect the intensity of the storms. But the reality is, even before we consider the effects of climate change, the Caribbean region has always been located in an area prone to disasters. And I can tell you, as someone that had to lead an organization out of the devastation of Hurricane Ivan in 2004, you basically look at your entire infrastructure being wiped away in 1 hour. Decades of progress, decades of investments gone in 1 hour, and you really and truly have to build back up from scratch. Quick was established in 2023, and let me recognize our main development partners and supporters. The program has been led by the Inter-American Development Bank with support from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the Caribbean Development Bank, and with, of course, significant support from the Government of the United Kingdom through the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. QUIC has 3 components. The first component is what we call the response component, and this component is designed to provide immediate support to utilities after a disaster. And this involves, of course, a lot of pre-planning, training, pre-advanced logistics, knowing what systems are where, what materials are needed where, who has the human resource capacity to work where, and of course, most importantly, how do you get persons from point A to point B in the immediate aftermath of a disaster when your normal routes of communication are severely disrupted. So that's the first component, the response component. The second component is the parametric insurance component. And this component provides parametric insurance protection for utilities that purchase a policy. And quickly, parametric insurance, for those that are not familiar with the concept, slightly different to indemnity insurance. You're not insuring a specific asset. You're insuring the entire water sector, and it's based on model losses and model probabilities. The payouts from parametric insurance policies are delivered within 14 days, and that cash is significant in allowing and helping the utilities to recover post-disaster. And the third component is the resilience component. We're not just looking at how we assist utilities to recover quickly after a disaster. We're building in resilience components. We are allowing utilities and facilitating them to gain access to concessionary funding to make the necessary capital interventions in their system, looking at vulnerabilities, fixing those vulnerabilities, so in the event that there is a disaster, the effect on the network, the effect on the country is significantly less. One of the most important factors in determining how a country, how a population, or how a society recovers from a disaster is the ability of the water and wastewater sector to operate. And this resilience component is looking ahead and making the necessary strategic investments up front to say, we are looking ahead to make sure that if a disaster does strike, the effect on the network, the effect on the country is less. So this puts QUIC in a quick perspective. As I said, it's an innovative, it's a first of its kind facility, putting together these 3 components with one main disaster management and financing objective, and specifically designed for the water sector, for the water and wastewater utilities. And as I get my warning, I will just remind persons that while the image on the right is 98% of the time in the Caribbean, the image on the left is a harsh reality that we have to continue to prepare for and plan ahead for, because it's a phenomenon that we cannot stop. I thank you very much. I look forward to having an opportunity to engage persons, either at the conference. I have my email there. We'd be happy to engage other persons. We're looking for other partners to come on board, persons that are interested in the Caribbean, in the water sector. We'd be happy to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think we're all interested in preserving the nice beaches in the Caribbean, so hopefully you will get lots of emails.
Again, I'm back in Spanish, and we have the last presentation concerning the series of presentations before going on to the conversation with everyone. Let me give the floor to Alberto Manganelli. He's the Executive Director of the Regional Center for the Management of Subterranean Water, and he shall be presenting the Guarani Aquifer, and he will be addressing the sustainable financial strategies for this aquifer. Esteemed Alberto, thank you so much for being connected with us. You have the floor now. Well, thank you and good afternoon. Good morning to the region. First of all, I wish to thank the organizers and specifically GAF for having invited me to participate during this session. Let me be brief and to provide you with a context. We can say that the regional projects are the tool through which we propose and implement cooperation, which includes programs, projects concerning technical cooperation or cooperation actions in general that are implemented in 2 or more countries and that are enshrined in the defined priorities by the countries in the regional agendas. Enhancing integration and border cooperation, the solution of common problems, and the implementation of regional policies. International and regional cooperation, together with the development of innovative and sustainable funding models, which are crucial to overcome hurdles and to assure effective and fair management of transboundary water resources. The funding mechanisms have a global geographical influence, and the cases of the aquifer systems, basically with funding from international or regional institutions, have been able to significantly increase the level of cooperation within these transboundary aquifers. Now let's look at, as an example, the importance that that has as well the funding concerning the Guarani Aquifer system. Concerning this system, we have seen the development of 2 projects. The first one between 2003 and 2009. The name was called Project for Environmental Protection and Sustainable Development of the Guarani Aquifer System. And the second one between 2022 and 2024 to end in December of this year, and it is the implementation of the Strategic Action Program (GAS), enabling regional actions of the Guarani Aquifer. Now, the first of these projects for environmental protection, we shall define which have been those important landmarks concerning funding. First of all, it allowed an important increase concerning the knowledge of the system that we knew back then. It allowed, in turn, to handle themes that were not taken into account as countries as a whole. For example, transporter pilot projects, to have a map of the complete system under one single system of coordinates. Let's remember it's 4 countries with 4 different systems. The exchange of information as well, that back then we only had through academic linkages and to establish a governance system and so on and so forth. And in turn, concerning the Guarani Aquifer, it's clear that whilst there was funding, there were joint activities. And once this first project ended, these activities dropped until they disappeared. But we can underscore the importance beyond the execution of the project. This development imposed a Guarani mark in the world, so it increased the visibility of subterranean water at large. It was the first gas project concerning transporter, and its success allowed the development of other projects in other parts of the world. It favored, in turn, the execution of national or domestic projects because there were greater facilities to obtain funding because of its importance. And it allowed, finally, the creation of research groups. In other words, the development of training within these countries. And finally, the current project that ends in December, as I said, funded by Jeff, whose implementation agency is the Development Program for Latin America, CAF, and UNESCO, which is the executive agency, has allowed to rehandle those actions of the first project. And once again, the institutional structures are beginning to be involved again. Hence, the two most important aspects are represented because of the institutionalization of mechanisms to strengthen transporter aid between these countries. In other words, the monitoring model project and the network, which is a pilot project, they purchase equipment, chemical analysis, perforations, and so on and so forth. Drilling, in other words, and the committee concerning dissemination, which has taken into account indigenous aspects, gender aspects as part of their project as well. In short, this is a bird's eye view concerning the funding of these projects that will allow progress amongst cooperation of countries and to be able to achieve the SDG 16. Thank you, Alberto. And with this, we conclude with this session with the different presentations. So thank you kindly for having accompanied us in person as well as virtually, those of you that have presented their experiences. And now let's go on to the conversation. And for this purpose, I don't know if you know, but I've already carried out many exercises. I've gone up and down the stage. And I wish to invite up on stage the three panel members for the next conversation that will take place. First, Astrid Hillards. She's a senior specialist at GEF concerning international waters. Welcome. This panel will be in both languages. Ana Laura Elizondo, our dear Anita. She's the head of water safety of the FEMSA institution. Thank you for being here. Please address the floor with a microphone. And thereafter, Silvia Chavez. She's the cooperation management at an international level with the Water Commission in Mexico. Thank you kindly, the three of you, for being here with us.
Thank you very much, beautiful ladies, for being here with us today.
Again, as we have already done, focusing on the Americas. We shall hold a series of questions. Please be brief when answering.
We ask you to please be brief in your answers, since we have a few questions that we would want to talk to you about.
And thereafter, a minute to convey your thoughts. I'm giving you my back, so
the first question will be for Astrid, and then we would want to know, what do you see is the role of grant versus national / or public or private financing mechanism in transboundary cooperation?
Thank you very much, and there's probably not a short answer to this, but I will try. And I also want to excuse that I'm coming up with the telephone. It's just to make the translation for me because I don't speak Spanish, so... So I'm coming from the GF, the Global Environment Facility, and it has an international waters window that is specialized or focused on helping countries to come together, like the Guarani we heard about, and the stories that Susanne talked in her introductory speech. You know, coming together, understanding each other, looking at exchange of information, and looking at the basin or groundwater basin at the same scale and with the same data information, creating opportunities for cooperation, building institutions behind it, and then coming into a strategic action program, which we just heard from the Guarani, and then implementing it. So you can imagine that this is, first of all, a long-term process that needs to be funded in a series of projects, which DF tries to do with 18 agencies, CAF included, which we have heard many times. Honestly, in a lot of times when you bring regional players together, and there hasn't been cooperation, and you need to find out the same data, and you need to trust each other, and you need to understand each other's system, each other's interests, each other's needs in order to negotiate an agreement. That is where the grant finance is essential. Nobody takes out a loan. There's not a private sector coming to get countries together and looking at processes and institutional building and all of that and building capacity. Once this cooperation matures, there's a continuum. There's rarely, no cooperation and full cooperation. It matures over time. These institutions, of course, also need to start to self-fund. As Susanne talked about, there needs to be co-cost funded by the countries or by innovative financing schemes. But once it comes to strategic action programs, which also include infrastructure and so forth, that is on the institutional and on the implementation side where public finance, countries need to own it, and loans and grants are essential because grant resources cannot build water infrastructure. It's just not enough. So this is where it ramps up and the grants slowly should come down. So first of all, for ownership of the institution, and when you come to the investments, just for the sheer size that you need to leverage. So there's, I think, is going with the continuum. Once there's a lot of institution trust building still, there's probably more grant needed, and then it goes to the private and the hard investments.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Very, I think it was pretty short and clear. So thank you. So thank you very much. We remind the audience if you have any questions afterwards, all our presenters will be here even after the event. If you want to send them to us, we can definitely get them answered from you. So I'm now going to go to Fundación FEMSA. So Anita, we heard the case presented by Todd from WRI, which is, I know, an important ally for you in Fundación FEMSA. In this case, then, could you share with us the challenges that you see for as a private sector institution in order to invest and unleash more sustainable financial mechanisms and watershed cooperation?
Of course, Ana Maria, and I shall address the floor in English. Well, thank you kindly for your question. We have been trying for many years now to unblock and trying to see how we can obtain new financial mechanisms to the table. Things are complex. It's challenging as well. And there are three important themes that we need to keep in mind for this to take place. The first one would be measurements, assessments. We need to have rigorous or stringent plans to understand the system much more. In other words, what are we measuring? What are we talking about? To be able to have the proper foundations to be able to create these financial mechanisms. These financial mechanisms mean risks to be able to obtain proper measurement systems. On many occasions, we do not wish to invest in measurements and see the results immediately, but it's important to be able to allocate resources to the measurement systems, to innovative systems, and lastly, once we have a robust measurement system, the legal framework has a very important role to play. Thus, we need to be more flexible, to be able to truly allow these funding mechanisms work for the long term. Well, thank you kindly. Thank you, Ana. And let's give way to Silvia. This is the third question of the series. We wish to know which are the attributions of CONAGUA, the water system in Mexico, concerning transporter matters that you might share with us. Well, hello. Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, a few moments to thank the invitation of the Inter-American Development Bank for my participation. It's a pleasure to share things with Astrid and Ana Laura. Thank you very much. I hope that some of you do not know, many will not know what is the National Commission, but hopefully this information is important. By the way, I see many known faces which surely know my commission. The National Water Commission is an institution of the federal government in charge of the management of water systems throughout the country, Mexico including the resources which are shared in the northern and southern borders. And for this purpose, we need to manage resources to guarantee water to our population and water for productive aspects, for industry, for agricultural purposes. And another function which is not well known by all is is that we're also in charge not only of the construction, but of the operations and the maintenance of many of the infrastructure works in the country. And also, we are in charge of monitoring, together with the National Meteorological System, the meteorological phenomena, and to protect the population concerning these adverse phenomena, flooding and droughts. All of this in a country which has a very large extension of land, which is very different. The regions are very different. We have, for example, an arid region, semi-arid region. It occupies 2/3 parts of the country. Nonetheless, in that region, that's where we see the concentration of 77% of the population, and we generate over 80% of the GDP in the country. Thus, we have a complex overview. But in the south, on the other hand, it occupies a third part of the country. We have more water. 2/3 parts of renewable available water is found in this region of the country, and a concentration of population of 23% and 18% of the generation of GDP. Hence, these are two difficult and complex realities. Having said this, we have shared borders and shared waters in the north and the south. And let me talk more about the north, because that's where we have a legal established framework. We have a legal tool, which is the Water Treaty, the national one of 1944. We're talking of 80 years of this agreement. And within the framework of this agreement, we regulate all the international cooperation in terms of the waters that are being shared between both countries. We have established the International Commissions for Limits and Waters to support all the management. These are binational agencies known as SILA in Mexico. There is a SILA, an International Commission of Limits and Waters in Mexico. There's another one in the United States. And it's important to say that both of these are headed by women. Extraordinary diplomatic women, if you allow me to say so.
And to coordinate all of these efforts, there's a specific area that supports all of the management of SILA as of the National Water Commission. And of course, the same management of international cooperation participates supporting in cooperation with the U.S. SILA is not part of CONAGUA, the National Water Commission, but SILA depends on the external affairs. So as you can see, there's a series of institutions, of stakeholders, both within as outside from the institution, which participate in the management of border water regions, especially in the northern part. I don't know if I went over time. No, but it's also very interesting, and I wanted to point out things that were mentioned in the other things that we need to be careful. Like in Mexico, we cannot speak about regional advantage, but we know sometimes which are the realities that can happen between the differences among regions. So
I'm going to switch back to English. And I'm sorry, how you say GEF? In Spanish, we say GEF, so I don't know.
That's fine.
Okay, so GEF is a financial mechanism that provides support across different thematic fundings. So you have national, regional, and this includes nature-based solutions. So can all of these be combined? And are there any lessons that you would want to share with us on transboundary institutions?
Sure, can do that. Maybe I need to step a little bit back and explain what the GEF is. So
yeah, but don't step too
far
from, from the mic.
So the GEF, first of all, stands for the Global Environment Facility. It is a financial mechanism for many of the multilateral environmental agreements. So what's that? Biodiversity, climate change, land degradation, the Chemicals Convention, and we also have a window in international waters. So the way it works is there's a formula by biodiversity, by impacts from climate, and by emissions, where funding for the different conventions gets put in the pot, the GF, and then allocated to the countries. So when you're a country, you have a national allocation, probably not the right legal word, but anyway, there's a pot of money for you to work on climate change and biodiversity and land degradation. Whereas the international waters funds, of course, they're not by country, right? It's shared waters. So this is a global fund, and that is used for regional projects. And similarly, so with chemicals and waste, it is not allocated by a country, but by issues. So that it's flexible to work on PCBs or on mercury and so forth. So these national allocations are really the country can determine what their priorities are, and then we help them to align it with the strategies and the guidance from the conventions. The international waters we talked about before, and it was also in the keynote, is really the process of getting countries together to build institutions and to implement things and come to a common water security and share the benefits across the basin for stable relations, for integration and peace. So these are always limited, right? So you need so many things, and there's so many priorities that you determine when you do a transboundary analysis. You say, okay, my country needs wetlands and biodiversity protection, there's land degradation, there's issues out of adaptation to be done. And then there's the regional, when we overlay as a region, we need priority 1, 2, 3, that is most important to improve the overall basin health and the overall basin cooperation. So yes, you can combine these sources, so it makes it much stronger. If you take the regional funds for really regional functions, common DSS decision support systems, data exchange, the regional institution building, and so forth. That's really done well with the regional funds, and these regional funds can also fund investments on the national scale. But if you beef that up with saying, each country wants to see rapidly something happening on their ground, if you can combine it easily in one project, you don't need to apply for different projects. You put it together and say, oh, in country A, we want to do certain things on biodiversity and climate adaptation, because you also can combine it with the climate change adaptation finance, all in one project, and put it forward so that benefits on the ground are much more easily felt, because you also put your national resources behind what the regional resources facilitate. A little bit of lessons, of course, nature-based solutions is a lot what the GEF does on all of these funds. And a lot of times they're, of course, on national level, because that's where the national investments come in and you see the benefits. So these are much more examples we have there. If it's on watershed protection and infiltration happening and helping the cities on the ground. So we hear about water funds. FEMSA is involved in many of those, and a lot of times the bottling industries and so forth, because they use water and they want clean water. But also the cities. If you look at the Kido Water Fund, if a city is very dependent on its upstream watershed, it will invest. And so you have these payment for ecosystem services schemes, which are water funds are one of them. We have very little yet. I think the Trifino is trying to develop something on the regional scale. But with climate change kicking in and you needing really to look at the wider watershed, we should take lessons, and at some point, I think we will come to the point that we see these regional investments happening. Same for, somebody before talked about sedimentation and the need to gear up, to have infrastructure holding up longer. So if there's a joint infrastructure like in the Senegal, or some regional important infrastructure that produces power or stores water, or helps for flood protection, wouldn't it make sense for countries in a basin to invest, or for the downstream countries to invest in watershed protection upstream to keep the infrastructure going forward? Because it makes economic sense and it makes factual sense. So I think there are lots of lessons learned we can pick up from these schemes. More difficult if you have a transboundary. Latin America, the continent has lots and lots of good examples on conservation trust funds. Look at FUNBIO and mechanisms that we can learn from that could be, it is a steady fund. There's an endowment being created, sinking fund first, but an endowment created also by investors to get to some conservation out funds. But once you have an endowment, you have a steady stream if you invest that to fund, for example, basin institutions. So the Okavango, for example, is starting to the Corp Fund for the same thing, not only to fund institutions, but to also fund investments on the ground for the big Okavango in a delta. There's a Mekong fund that also looks at a regional fund. So I think there's real opportunities to learn lessons, how they set this up institutionally with an outside investor money intermediary to give confidence to investors to put money in these financial institutions. And there's a big network in Latin America around that actually the world and the river basins should truthfully look at where there's the Pantanal or something involved that is of world value, and there will be investments in there. Institutional, I think I don't have so much more to add, but it's really important what was said in the keynote, that the grant funds over time phase out, so you have a steady inflow of investment into an institution that needs to come from national level or from these steady funds that get outside created and give a steady income to the institution. So they are stable, they are long-term, and they're not dependent on outside funding. So
thank you very much. And thank you for mentioning the water funds. This is something that we have been working with GEF and Fundación FEMSA for a while now in the Water Fund Alliance for Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you so much. Now I go to FEMSA.
FEMSA has been a great allied for. We have different innovations, and for those who want to come to our next session about innovation, technology, and we're going to be speaking about innovation sources. And I wanted to ask you, how is it that FEMSA is trying to innovate precisely on this sustainable finance space for the transboundary corporations? Yes, of course, Ana Maria, thank you very much, and thank you, Astrid, for mentioning that. I love the fact that we can be complementary. I think that the three of us here have a very important role in different organizations, different points of views, different perspectives, and we need to work at all levels. Otherwise, we're not going to get to make an impact. So I agree. I agree with you. I think it's absolutely important, the work that is being done. I'm going to give an example from the private sector and something that is very specific, showing you a project and tell you about a project that we are doing about agriculture in Guanajuato. And talking about what was being commented on the previous question, we managed to make very important savings. We can measure that. But the challenge comes in how do we save that? How do we conserve that? How can we manage to keep that water so that it will not be used by anyone else or it doesn't disappear? So in that gap, if we have those savings, if we could give a value to those savings, we could generate a financial mechanism that would be important and that could maybe be offered to pay to some investors who could invest in technology, in making a more efficient use of irrigation, then also helping the farmers who can pay for that technology. But that is a value that is not there yet. We're not ready yet, and that's why I'm insisting we need to work together so that we can improve and see the opportunities from the legal framework, be more flexible, see which could be a way to, well, work together so as to give that step and unblock important investments and have that ROI in the same projects. Well, just to comment also that other instruments that we are considering are forums, for instance, and impact, where companies can invest in impact innovation. That is something that we're trying to foster, this new innovation ecosystem, how we can incentivize more companies to join these challenges, to invest, and, well, to overcome those barriers. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we will go to Silvia. Silvia, would you like to share some lessons learned that Conagua has had in Mexico that could be useful for other regions or countries in the world? Have you tried to innovate in the sustainable financing for Transboundary? Yes, of course. Thank you, Ana Maria. I would like to begin with what Ana Laura has said. I'm going to dovetail that. And we have been speaking for many years. I have not been for long in the water sector since 2018, and I've been saying this for many years. I've heard since 2018 the need to have innovative mechanisms, financing, making a different kind of financial scheme for water, yet we are still falling under the public financing. And there's no budget for Conagua that might be enough. There could be numbers that say we need 130 million, 120 million pesos per year so that we can move forward for the next 10 years. I don't know if that is going to be enough. What I do know is that it is important to have differentiations. And that's where I think we can find the success of this development bank. In the NAR bank is a tool, is an instrument, is a vehicle that is specialized in transboundary matters and infrastructure for water. So I think that that would be a great example. Salvador was mentioning in his last slide. Of course, we have the experience. The National Water Commission participates very much as the Mexican counterpart in this joint investment program, and it has been a great success because it allows the cooperation, intensive dialogue amongst the two countries, and the mechanisms have been created, the work groups to create dialogue and think about suitable projects to finance under this program. And that is very good. It's a very good first step because you can see projects that have been reviewed, agreed upon. And as I was saying, the requirements are for them to have a real transboundary impact in different countries that can support the population. These are programs for drinkable water and sanitation. And this is the counterpart for the BEI, for the resources that go through NARPA and EPA, and the counterpart of the National Water Commission through the programs that we call federalized. We have a federalized program that is specifically for drinkable water and sanitation. And that program has some rules. And one of those rules is that, this program gives resources to all of the states, the 6 states of the country in the northern frontier. So what it does is the operational rules that Conagua will have a part of it, but then that means that the local authorities of the municipalities and states will add another part. So that's why Salvador's last slide is so interesting, because it adds the non-reimbursable resources and the resources that are given by the National Water Commission from its budget, but also the resources from the state and local authorities. And it can also be complemented, of course, that would be ideal, complemented with other financial mechanisms. NAGMAN can give credits so that these projects can be supported. Drinkable water projects are intensive in their use of resources to develop the projects, but also to execute them, and then also to give maintenance and follow-up to the structure. We have many cases of infrastructures that are built, but then for lack of resources do not get enough maintenance, so it's a lost investment. Another big mechanism, some experience we have in the Conagua, and I wanted to share with you, is this thing that we do internationally to try to look for alternatives in our financing, and this can be applied to any region of the country, both in the border states as with the agreement with the United States or with our neighbors in the southern frontier, but there are financing sources like GF, like GEF, which are somehow complicated to download resources, I must say. They have some preparation projects and executions which are fairly long, but availability is there. And of course, we have the historical experience with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank. We have had many loans and projects with them. And I wanted to mention that because even if it doesn't generate additional from the budget of the Water Commission, these are very important because I think that the technical support and the support during the whole process with its rules and the acquisitions can be very beneficial. So finally, my final conclusion is that we really need to create this financial system for water that we have been speaking of for years in Mexico. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylvia. We have just a few minutes to see if, well, first, before going to the Q&A, I wanted to know if any of you wanted to add anything else, or we can go to the Q&A. Yes? Maybe I would like to add that I do think that this cooperation model that we have with the joint investment programs in the U.S. is a fairly successful model because it has specialized a development bank in the border issues. It has specialized, well, forced somehow other sectors to add to the finance. And we also have an investment program which is joint called Frontier 2025 for all of the environmental sector led by the Natural Resources Ministry in Mexico. And well, those are 4 strategic goals. And one of those is, of course, to improve the quality of water, and it promotes the creation of infrastructure that is necessary to reuse and treat residual water. Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry if we cannot see. Okay, I'm sorry. I can see now. We have the lights. I'm sorry. We know you're there somewhere.
Thank you all for your presentations today. My name is Gregory Holliday with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Director of the 50 Liter Home Coalition. We heard today about excellent cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico and the treaty that's gone back 80 years. That treaty primarily deals, or almost exclusively deals, with surface water, but there are a lot of cities that share groundwater, and specifically El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, almost entirely groundwater, and almost no formal cooperation mechanism to manage that water. And so I'm wondering what resources exist, whether it's technical support or financial, to help cities like that on the border build a capacity for data sharing, data analysis, information, joint policy analysis. Thank you.
I don't know if Silvia wants to do it, or maybe the colleague. Salvador, are you still there? Yes. Just a few words, and then I'll let Salvador speak so that he can explain us a little bit more about what the Development Bank does in North America. To say that there's a mechanism within the treaty that is what we have developed. It's about 330 that are done amongst both countries in the International Limits in Water Commission. And what these minutes do is that they allow to work on very specific issues. There is a specific dialogue, a permanent dialogue with political, technical groups, with technical decisions, and they have tried, because many of these minutes have been done, they have demonstrated to be valuable. Not all issues are solved, of course. We know about the complications that there are in the borders, and yes, it is true that most of the actions that we carry out under the treaty are for over the groundwater. Of course, there's a need to do more in the groundwater, and of course the information that we can share with the United States is also going to be very important. I don't know if Salvador would like to add anything else. Yes, of course, very kind. Just to add to what Silvia was commenting, for the borderline in Mexico, I have been working for 30 years in this, and I think that in a very clear and tangible manner. We have managed to do a collaboration at the local level between El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, a very continuous communication, relatively informal, that does not depend on big protocols, and it has to do with solid waste, with sanitation during fires, or with chemical spills, where both countries cooperate, not only U.S. to Mexico, but also to being the U.S. the most developed country, but also Mexico cooperating with the U.S. in these kinds of emergencies. So to express that, it is also important to create these ecosystems at a local level, for that to be the more or less informal cooperation, and I think that what we have done in the border between Mexico and the U.S. Thank you very much, Salvador. Are there any more questions? We do not see you, but we know you're there. We still have a few minutes. Or anyone who would like to add a comment from those of you who are online or here in the room? If there are no more questions or comments, I would like to thank our experts for this panel. Thank you very much. And I would also like to tell everybody who's here with us, online and in person, thank you very much for having been here with us. We have one last session focused on science and technology, and we hope you can connect. And as you know, all of the information is going to be available, because we are very efficient almost immediately, on our social network and our webpage. So thank you very much, and enjoy your World Water Week.